Today we're beginning a new sermon series in the book of Song of Songs. And so I want to encourage you guys to open your Bibles to Song of Songs. Now some of you, as you're looking, you might notice that there isn't a Song of Songs in your Bible, and that is because depending on what version of the Bible you're using and what the translators did, they might call it Solomon's Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs. There's three different names. But if you grab the Bible in front of you, in the seat in front of you, like I have here, it's going to be called Song of Songs. So that's what we're going to go with during this message series. Sorry for the confusion with that. Most books in the Bible have very well-established traditional names. With this one, people have taken some liberties over the years to make the name this or that. And there's nothing wrong with any of those names. They're all apt. But I do want to just encourage you to turn there. If you're using the Bible I'm using from the seat in front of you, then we're going to be reading out of chapter 1 this morning. That'll be on page 672. So feel free to turn your way there. As you guys are making your way there in the Bible, in a moment I'll give you some context on this book, because this is an unusual book. Some would even say risque at points. But there's some really important stuff that God wants to communicate to us. While you're turning there, though, I just want to briefly share a story with you from the Pounds household recently. We had some interesting things happen in the house this week. And you know, a lot of people say nowadays that gender is a social construct, which is an interesting idea, because when you watch a young boy and a young girl playing with each other, you can see a whole lot of differences on the average, I would say. And certainly among our kids, this is the case. So we had our soon-to-be 5-year-old Hazel, and she and her two younger brothers, Marlo, who is almost 4 years old, and Hudson, who is just turned 2 years old, just last week. They're playing together. And Marlo and Hudson, they have toy guns in their house. They don't fire anything. They're just the big toy rifles. And we've told them they can't shoot each other with them, but they are allowed to hunt their stuffed animals. And so there are all kinds of exotic safaris that happen in the Pounds household throughout the week. And it's fun to watch those two kids, because these are pretty big toy guns, but they'll be going around the corner, sneaking around, and there's their teddy bear, and they both go and fire at their teddy bear. And if the teddy bears ever uprise to take over the world, our sons will be prepared. They'll be ready. But Marlo and Hudson were playing their games, and Hazel doesn't seem to be quite as interested in that game, and so she'll watch. But in the middle of their getting ready to set up another ambush on two teddy bears set up by the couch in the living room, Hazel walked up with a much smaller toy pistol. And she said to Marlo, she walked up to Marlo and said, "The baby gun says hi to the mommy gun." And Marlo looked at her and was like, "Hi." And she said, "Where's the daddy gun?" He said, "He died." And she said, "No, I think he's at work." So you can see their brains are going totally different directions. And it's funny to watch, because even with toy cars and stuff, Marlo and Hudson will grab their toy cars and they'll slam them into each other and they'll blow up, and all kinds of action-packed things are happening. And Hazel will come over with the mommy car that wants to talk to the baby cars. And so it's all about these relationships and these familial dynamics for Hazel, and for the boys it's about destroying things and building their strength and their mind. Fun to see the differences. We're going to see some of those differences as we read through the book of Song of Songs in the time ahead. And God willing, I think there's a lot that we can learn from this. And this book was often used historically to help young men and women actually sort of have the talk about sexuality and what it is. And in fact, many people in ancient Hebrew weddings would even sing portions of this song in their wedding, and they would recite it. Now, in the ancient Hebrew, this would have rhymed more. There would have been more word plays that we aren't going to necessarily see, and yet the depth of what's communicated here will still be here. Now, as you might have gathered by the fact that some people call this Solomon's Song of Songs, most scholars hold that this book was in fact written by King Solomon. And King Solomon is an interesting person to have written this book for a few reasons. In a very positive way, because Solomon was widely regarded to be one of the wisest men who ever lived. He had a great deal of insight, and he wrote several books of the Bible, like the book of Proverbs, where there is so much wisdom you'll feel like you're drinking it from a fire hose. There's a lot to take in. And this is going to be similar in that way. On the flip side of that, though, Solomon started out life rather modestly as a king, and yet when it came particularly to the way he handled romance and love, things got a little bit out of control. Solomon didn't listen to what God had said about monogamy, and for that matter, about not marrying foreign wives who have other religions that they're honoring. And so in the course of Solomon's reign as king of Israel, he got to a point where by the end of his life, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Can you imagine? I don't even think I could keep all the names straight. It'd be ridiculous. And the kids and grandkids and all of that, that'd be crazy. Christmas was an expensive time. Christmas had anyway. But so Solomon wrote this book, and we see some real dysfunction in his life, and yet we see a lot of wisdom too. And I'm going to suggest to you that, in fact, as is traditionally held, Solomon is the author of this book. But there are some questions as we read it about whether Solomon is one of the characters in the book. And I want to point out with Song of Songs, it's not going to read like every other book of the Bible. It is, first of all, it's poetry, and so it's easy to miss out on the poetic imagery that's here, and we'll have to explore that some today. But secondly, it's often been said of Song of Songs that it's as if it's a story without the plot being given, which is strange. So we're going to hear about a man and a woman and their community. And those are the three main characters we're going to hear, but none of them will be named. We'll see that the man and woman appear in context to both be shepherds. But some people have suspected, well, maybe Solomon was the man, and maybe this was the first woman Solomon ever fell in love with, or maybe later in Solomon's life, even though it's not recorded in the Bible, maybe he left all of his wives and he went to this one woman and became monogamous again. I think that that's a little contrived. I think Solomon, in all likelihood, did write this book, but really I think one of the purposes in it being laid out in sort of a general sense with a man and a woman and their community and not all the other details being there is because the truth that we're going to see in this book, it transcends the setting that they found themselves in and even the one we find ourselves in. There's some deep fundamental truths about love and romance and even looking beyond the immediate context to friendships itself and relationships that we can really absorb out of this and we can learn a lot from. So as we're reading this, I want to encourage you. You'll hear about she and he and their friends or their community. I think we need to think of this in a general sense as we're going through it. I'll make some arguments as we go through the book as to why. But this is, people who are being used to represent these concepts. Perhaps they were literal people. Perhaps this is merely being used as a story to convey a deeper meaning. Either way, God put it there, and he has something that each and every one of us can take from it. And I hope that you guys will benefit from it that way. I'll also mention, as we read this, there are some scholars who suggest that this book is meant to be allegorically translated, that it's meant to be a metaphor for God's love for Israel or for Jesus' love for the church. I can see where there's actually some interesting meanings that can be taken from that, and there's some meaningful thoughts that can come from it. But the traditional Hebrew understanding of this book was that it was a literal guy and a literal lady and their community and how they responded to one another. So as we read through it again, I suggest you focus on it that way. You can allow your mind to stream off in those other directions. And I'll also mention the title of the book, Song of Songs. This book is called Song of Songs, and that doesn't mean it's a song with a whole bunch of other songs in it, but it's being used in the typical Hebrew sense, like King of Kings or Lord of Lords. Song of Songs means this is the best of every song written. That's literally what its title is declaring to us. This is the best song that you could possibly sing or read. And so that's a pretty bold assertion, especially considering within the Bible there are hundreds of different songs that have been recorded. The book of Psalms is filled with a bunch of worship songs the nation of Israel used. And yet this book had a very special place in the nation of Israel. It was even traditionally in Jewish history read during the Passover, during the remembrance of God's wrath passing over Egypt and God freeing his people from Pharaoh by putting his final plague on them. And as the Israelites celebrated the Passover each year, this was one of the books that they read because of its connection to the love that God had for them. And so there is something meaningful that we can take from it that way. So anyway, we're in Song of Songs. We'll start with chapter 1. As usual, we're going to break this down into 5 different parts. We'll read each section, we'll stop and we'll discuss it, and I hope that God will use that to bring it to life. I'll also mention there's going to be a lot of different poetic imagery here, so we're going to do this largely verse by verse. We'll read it and we'll go back through it because it's easy to miss out on what's being said. So let's go and say a prayer, say a brief prayer, and then I'll give you one more tidbit of insight into how we'll read it, and then we'll go from there. Heavenly Father, this is a book that a lot of us probably haven't read and spent a lot of time in, and yet relationships affect our lives in profound ways, whether they be friendships or dating relationships or whatever it might be. Father, I pray that you would open our hearts to this. Help us not to be focused on our neighbor and whatever dysfunction they might have, but instead on ourselves, because if we're honest about it, there's plenty of brokenness there. Lord, I pray that through the reading of your word, through the conviction of your Spirit, our lives might be changed through this. Lord, we love you and we pray these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit. Amen. One last observation I feel I need to make before we begin this book. There's going to be a little more context than we sometimes have, but it's necessary for us to truly understand this. And that is that dating, believe it or not, in the ancient world was not the exact same as dating is today. Is that believable enough? Now, nowadays, if you were interested in somebody, you might go up to them and say, have a conversation with them and say, hey, would you like to go get coffee sometime and hang out? That would be a common way to start that conversation. A relationship could go from there. It worked for me years ago, and it's paid off really nicely. But in the ancient world, arranged marriages were much more common, particularly in the nation of Israel. This is the common way that these things were handled. And I know that as we say that, probably a lot of you guys have your skin crawl a little bit and say, arranged marriages, that's terrifying. But a few things I want to point out with this. I want to point out logistically how it works, but I also want to point out just some practical elements of this. First of all, arranged marriages are actually something that are commonplace in countries like India nowadays. And it is sort of fascinating to note that in India, the divorce rate and the marital success rate is actually higher than it is in the United States. So this might not be as broken this approach as it seems like. But let's talk about some of the pragmatic aspects of this. If I was a young man in the ancient world, and I saw Annabelle and I thought, wow, and I decided I want to get to know that girl more, then I wouldn't just go up to her and directly talk to her. What I would need to do is, first of all, figure out who she is. I might even ask some questions in the neighborhood. Do you know who that girl is? Do you know where she lives? And then I would go back to my parents as a young man, and I would tell my mom and dad, I met the most beautiful girl in the world. I saw her, and I really am interested in someday marrying this girl. And so I could go have that conversation with my parents. Now, if my parents knew something about that person that I didn't, maybe they'd share that with me. But if they thought, well, Lloyd, you seem like a grown-up enough, and it seems like you're at a point where you could get married, this makes sense, and she's from a good family, let's go have a conversation with her parents. So then they would go, particularly my father, would be expected to go to Annabelle's parents, and particularly to his father, and to have a conversation and say, my son is quite interested in your daughter. And if you're open to it, I'd like to look at the possibility of them becoming married someday. And the first step in that would be, if Annabelle's dad heard that, if he was smart, he'd say, absolutely not, that guy's trouble, no. But if he missed that, and he didn't make that observation, which is what happened, then he would say, you know what, actually Lloyd has a good reputation, that sounds like a good deal, I think my daughter would be a good match with somebody like that. Now, of course, this system is predicated on your parents actually loving you, right? I mean, them actually wanting what's good for you. And on the averages, that's typically the case. That's typically what happened. There are examples you can see of somebody having a really pretty daughter and marrying her off to some terrible person because he had lots of money and he could get paid for it. And those stories do exist, and obviously that's not something that's smiled upon in the Bible or morally otherwise. But typically what happened is the parents actually had enough love for their child, and you can imagine that if I went to Annabelle's parents, or if my father went to Annabelle's parents and asked them, they would probably go to Annabelle and say, have you heard of this Lloyd guy? Do you know him? What do you think of him? And if she said, no, then that would probably be the end of it. But those interactions would happen. If they decided to go ahead, then we would enter into what would be a formal engagement. And that, in effect, is when our actual dating process began. If they said yes, then it might be a few weeks, it might be several months, but we would have a time period where Annabelle and I would get a chance to interact with each other. We'd get this opportunity to get to know each other while with other people, not a bunch of private time left alone on an island together. But we'd get this opportunity to get to know each other one-on-one and decide if that's something we wanted to go ahead with it. Now, interestingly, during that time, we would actually be in a legal commitment to each other. And so I couldn't go see somebody else, or it would be considered in society's eyes the same thing as adultery. She's the one I'm dating right now, and we are in a fixed engagement, and until one of us decides to go through the formal, almost divorce-like process of ending that engagement, then it continues forward, and there were some big consequences. But it was an opportunity for us to discover if this is what we wanted or not, and often in a pretty short time period, that young couple would discover what they wanted to do, what their desire was. And so it would often work out well. Now, it's good to know this is the way relationships were done back then. So as we read this book, there is a compelling argument to be made that this young couple has started this story off already engaged. But again, already engaged doesn't mean what it means out in Western society, right? That doesn't mean we spent months dating each other already. That means our parents both thought we'd be a good match. And now we're going to see where this relationship has the potential to go. So we're just getting to know each other, or that is right around the corner. Perhaps there's been some conversations and we're in similar enough social groups that we can have a few interactions, but it's going to be there really shortly. So good to know that as we start this book, we're reading about these people. These are two people who would have known each other's reputations. They probably have had some conversations with their parents about it, but it isn't the traditional Western dating system. And in all likelihood, they're really, for the first time, getting to explore those possibilities with one another and see where the relationship leads. And hopefully that'll help you see this as it unfolds. So let's begin with verses 1 through 4. And we'll begin by hearing from she, as she speaks about him and what her thoughts on him are. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfumes. Your name is like perfume poured out. No wonder the young women love you. Take me away with you. Let us hurry. Let the king bring me into his chambers. We rejoice and delight in you. We will praise your love more than wine. How right they are to adore you. Okay, so as we start off, the woman begins. She's met this guy. Like I said, perhaps the engagement has started, or perhaps this is largely just from her interactions in the community learning about him. But she doesn't start off slow. She says, boy, let me kiss you with the kisses of my mouth. Now, good to note that in the ancient Eastern world, it was common to greet somebody, often even somebody of the opposite sex, with a kiss on the lips. It was a casual thing done, a lot like a handshake. But the way that she's talking about this does not sound like a handshake, does it? Okay, so there's something more meant here. She's seeing him and saying, whoa, oh man, I want to kiss you right on the lips. That's where I'm at with this thing. And so she says that to begin with, for she says, for your love is more delightful than wine. She is already beginning to fall for this guy. And we'll hear some of the reasons in a moment that'll be significant. Now, the idea of your love being better than wine, good to know, Coca-Cola didn't exist at this era, so she couldn't use that, which probably would have been a better choice. But if you don't know, I'm a fan of that. But wine is one of the sweetest beverages that existed on earth. And whether it be grape juice or grape juice that's been fermented, whatever the case, it's very sweet. And she's basically saying, as sweet and intoxicating as that is, that's the way I feel when I'm around you. And there's this sense of, you think of that how you might feel after having a glass of wine, and that sense of being at ease, or that intoxicating feeling that comes with it. In effect, she's saying, being around you makes me feel that way. I feel intoxicated by your presence. It's that pleasurable for me to experience. And unlike the wine, this intoxication of love might actually last more time. So, verse 3, it says, pleasing is the fragrance of your perfumes. Your name is like perfume poured out. Okay, so she gives what the metaphor is really standing for. When she says your name is like perfumes poured out, that's good for us to sort of zero in on first. Now, in the ancient Hebrew, the term your name, it doesn't just mean your name, as in my case, Lloyd, but it means your name as in your reputation in this community. In other words, what other people view your character as being like. Your name is like wine poured out. In other words, you have such a good reputation in this place, she says. She's saying of him. And some of this may even be an internal monologue that she's having, just thinking about this guy. But to her, she says, your name, when I think about you and the reputation you have in this community, boy, it's like somebody took a bottle of perfume and poured it out on the table. Nobody will miss it. Anyone who walks in the room with you is going to say, that's a good man. That's somebody of integrity. That's somebody you'd want to be around. And she's saying, that's incredibly attractive. And not only that, but at the end of verse 3, she goes on and says, no wonder the young women love you. So another aspect of this is she's seeing, not only do I think you're captivating and that you're an enchanting gentleman, but on top of that, every other young, eligible girl in this community wishes that you were theirs. And that can be a compelling thing, can't it? Having that sense, especially I think back to high school, if there was one guy who a lot of the girls started to like, pretty soon all the girls started to like him, right? That's sort of the way that it often veered. But it's in part because of this, and admittedly sometimes our values are skewed in that age, but if there's a lot of people who are attracted to the person, often it's because of something like, that's a confident person, they're hardworking, they have good integrity, that's the kind of person that you'd want to be with. And she is looking at this guy and saying, all of this is the case. In verse 4, she continues on and says, take me away with you. Let's hurry. In other words, let's not wait for this whole marriage thing. Let's just jump into it. Let's go for it. And then she said, let the king, the second part of verse 4, let the king bring me into his chambers. Now, when you hear that word, chambers, I think oftentimes we think of bed chambers in the modern world. In the ancient Hebrew, there were bedroom chambers. So that could be a thing, but it would have said bedroom chambers. Normally your chambers are the social area in which you'd have big gatherings in your residence, wherever that might be. And so in effect it's like saying, bring me into the banquet hall. Now a banquet hall, if you're thinking of somebody running off with somebody getting married to them and running off in life together, that would be a big area where which would be a hub in a wedding. And so in effect she's saying, open up your house, let's throw together a banquet, we should get married now. This is where this thing's going. I'm all for this relationship. Now, it's interesting to see how her friends respond to that. And this is, again, friends were the community in general around them. They say, we rejoice and delight in you. We will praise your love more than wine. See, so for the community, this is a telling thing. And folks, I hate to say this, but we often like to ignore this, don't we? I mean, if we're frank about it, even touching back on the arranged marriage thing, it's interesting to think how we probably have all met somebody who might have been a whole lot better off in their relationships if their parents had chosen their spouse for them, right? Probably most of us have seen that situation before. And similarly, oftentimes when we enter a relationship with somebody, we get to a point where people around us are saying, are you sure? That person? Are you sure? Maybe they've got some reservations, some questions about that person's integrity, or even questions about how compatible the two of you really are. And interestingly, we often like to ignore those things. In the modern world, even it's romanticized. It's us against the world. We'll go out against it. And yet, Song of Songs, as a theme throughout this book, we're going to see that what other people around you, and particularly in context, good, upright, upstanding, godly community members, what they say about the relationship is something maybe you should think about. And if everybody around you who's a decent person, who has successful relationships, is saying, what are you doing? Then have pause on that one. But on the flip side of that, if they're all saying, man, the smartest thing you could do in the world right now is to marry that person. Well, that's probably a sign too, isn't it? Maybe that's something to listen to. Again, I'm not talking about your craziest friend that you have that's always encouraging you to make poor decisions. We're talking about respected community members. But in context, these people are saying, the community members are saying, we rejoice and we delight in you. The you there is in regard to him. But from the masculine article, it's in reference to the guy. And we will praise your love more than wine. And in effect, they're saying to her, lady, you're right. That is a good man. You two would be a great match, and we're totally behind you if you decide to pursue this relationship. We back that. All right, let's start at the second half of verse 4, and we'll read forward with verses, in effect, 5 through 7. This is her speaking. How right they are to adore you. Dark am I, yet lovely, daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the tent curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me, because I am dark, because I am darkened by the sun. My mother's sons were angry with me and made me take care of the vineyards. My own vineyards I have neglected. Tell me, you whom I love, where you graze your flock, and where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman beside the flocks of your friends? Okay, so now the woman begins to turn towards one of her insecurities. And we're going to see a lot of attributes of who she is and some of her background, actually, from what she says here. And one of the first things she laments is her dark complexion. She says, my skin is like the tents of Kedar. And Kedar is a region within Jerusalem. And the people of Kedar were, among other things, famous for the fact that inside their society, typically they would make their tents from goat skins, And they preferred to take the blackest goats that they had in the whole herd and use those to make the tents. And so they would have these very black hides that made up their residences. And she says basically, that's how dark my skin is. Or like the curtains in Solomon's palace, that he has black curtains that are well known in there. That's how dark my complexion is. So you might find it weird that she's talking about her complexion. But in the ancient world, in ancient Israel, and outside of ancient Israel even, there was a favoring on the averages of women who had fairer complexions. And a big part of that is that typically only women who were from nobler families, who were from wealthier families, would be able to be in a position where their skin was fair. It was a less common physical attribute. And if you were in a family that worked a lot and you were outside working in the desert a lot, as you might guess, because you don't have SPF 1000 that you can use, your skin's going to get darker in color. It's just naturally going to tan. Now, there's nothing morally wrong with having a darker complexion, and there's nothing the Bible ever says bad about it, but in her society, she saw this as a major detriment. And she looked at herself and thought, boy, I know that we're beginning this relationship, but I'm scared he's not going to want anything to do with me. If you look at me, my skin is really dark and tan. And she explains why. She goes on to say, because my brothers, the sons of my mother, they make me go out and tend their orchards. So typically, it would have been the man's responsibility to have tended those. And from the context, we can't help but wonder, perhaps has her father passed away? Is he not there anymore? Because it's unusual that the brothers would have this authority over her. And yet, the brothers, we'll see later, there's some things pointing to this notion. Probably her mother is widowed, and now her brothers are running the household, and it seems like there's sort of a Cinderella story going on here, where she's getting mistreated and told, you go do all the work for us, you take care of things, it's your problem, get out there and get it done. And she basically says, I've taken care of their orchards, they're in great shape, but my own orchard, my own body, it's suffered for it. I have really dark skin. And she goes on out of that insecurity, and she goes to this man and she asks him, tell me where your flocks are grazing at. Tell me where they are. And again, in context, we can see both of them seem to be shepherds. And so she's asking at the midday point, in the hottest heat of the day, when traditionally shepherds would go out and take some time to rest, perhaps take a nap, or sit around in the shade and just try to get a little bit of rest midday and not be out in the peak of the heat. She wants to know where he's going to be at when that's happening, because she wants to go have a conversation with him. And yet, even asking for that favor, to know where he's at so she can have further conversation, even then, she still comes back to, but if I go, I feel bad because I might have to put a veil around my head. Often in the ancient world, women who were highly ashamed of themselves, somebody like a prostitute, might have used a veil to cover their face. And in effect, she's saying, I feel like I'm so physically disfigured by the sunburn or the permanent tan that I have, that I might even just have to cover my face. I just feel so embarrassed by it. Now there's a question about how her community will respond to that, and also how he'll respond to that, right? And clearly in her insecurity, she's bringing this up. She's worried, what will he do? And now as we read forward with verses 8 through 11, we'll see how both parties respond to that. Verse 8, if you do not know, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of the sheep, and graze your goats by the tents of the shepherds. I liken you, my darling, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariot horses. Your cheeks are beautiful with earrings, your neck with strings of jewels. We will make you earrings of gold and studded silver. Now, I have to mention as we continue that there are some scholars who disagree on exactly when these dialogue breaks happening. And some versions, like the English Standard Version of the Bible, I think that you'll actually see the he placed up at the beginning instead of the friends, so that it's actually him who's saying she's the most beautiful of all women. But regardless, here immediately after her insecurity, there's this strong affirmation of her being beautiful, and also instruction being given, either by him or the community who's so supportive of this relationship. And they're saying, lady, if you want to meet with him, go right that way. Follow the tracks out there. We know where he rests his sheep each day. There's this tree-filled area out there. Go make yourself at home. It'd be great for you two to sit down and have a conversation. We're all behind it. And he goes on to verse 9 say, I liken you, my darling, to a mare among Pharaoh's horses, among his chariot horses. Now, Pharaoh in the ancient world was famous for having some of the best horses in the world. In fact, the kingdom of Egypt has been one of the dominant kingdoms for hundreds of years. And so Pharaoh would have had a very profound collection of horses. But not only would he have had a lot of horses, but when he's driving around town in his fancy chariot, you can bet he's going to be bringing the best of the best to go do that. And the point here from the guy isn't to say, your face kind of reminds me of a horse. It's him instead saying, you're the best of the best. I don't know what you're so insecure about, lady. Man, when I look at you, I am spellbound. You're gorgeous. Like, you are the most exceptional of the exceptional. You're exactly what a king would want if he was in this position. And so he is giving her this high praise. Verse 10, he says, your cheeks are beautiful with earrings. I prefer the way the English Standard translates this. More literally, he says, your cheeks are like ornaments. I find this particularly odd because in the Levitical law, women were forbidden from wearing earrings. Piercings in the ancient world were seen as a mark of slavery. If you had somebody and you owned them as a possession, you might put an earring on them so you could grab and lead them around using it. That was one of the earliest uses of earrings. And so, but the literal translation is your cheeks are like ornaments. In other words, they're colorful, they're radiant. You have a beautiful face. You think your face is sunburned? I think it is spellbinding, he says. And your neck is like necklaces, more literally like necklaces, not that it's covered in necklaces. But that I look at it and you can think of it maybe like a delicate string of pearls. It's long and it's smooth. And so he is saying, man, you're gorgeous. I don't know what you're talking about. And so she has these instructions on where to find him. And as we go forward, again, we have, in effect, a dialogue happening, but the plot not quite there. So we need to kind of fill in some of the details on our own. In all likelihood, I think what's actually happened here is now we're sort of moving forward in time for the later half of this chapter. She's actually gone out to where his sheep graze, and he's going to have a conversation with him now, and they're going to get to know each other more. And we'll see that by the shifted setting that will soon be described. So let's continue on then with verses 12 through 14. While the king was at his table, my perfume spread its fragrance. My beloved is to me a sachet of myrrh resting between my breasts. My beloved to me is a cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyards of En-gedi. Now, at the beginning of verse 12, we see her refer to him as a king. It's good to note that some people will say this is an argument for Solomon actually being the person referred to here. That's a weak argument in that in the ancient world, inside and outside of Hebrew culture, just as it is today, it's not uncommon for men and women to refer to each other as king or queen or prince or princess, and to do it in a favorable way. In other words, you're saying you are the type of person who seems like you could be king of this country, or seems like you could be the queen. You are just so majestic and wonderful and exceptional. And so it's a term of endurement, and it doesn't necessarily mean royalty. It's especially weird if it is royalty that this person is a shepherd, because that's one of the lowliest of occupations. And again, some say it's actually Solomon. He's faking her out, pretending to be a shepherd, but in fact he's the king. I think it's wisest to just view this again as an ordinary man and an ordinary woman, and these strong feelings that they're having for each other. But she says, the king is at his table. This makes it sound like they're at their meeting place now. And she says that her perfume that she's wearing is spreading its fragrance. And she says, but you are like a sachet of myrrh or henna blossoms from En-gedi. Now, perfume in the ancient world was quite expensive. To actually extract oils from things like flower petals, it took a lot. And the more common practice, especially for people who didn't have a lot of money, was to go ahead and take a porous pouch of some sort and put inside of it things like myrrh, which was a resin from a tree that has a pleasant scent to it. Actually something that was brought to Jesus when he was born, also something that was used in the temple as an incense. So you take something like that myrrh that has a nice pleasant smell, and then maybe grab some flowers and grab pieces of them that are especially aromatic, put them in the little sachet, tie it off, and hang it around your neck like a necklace. And then that aroma would be around you. And she says he's like myrrh or like henna blossoms from En-gedi. The oasis of En-gedi is an oasis several miles off the Dead Sea, to the east of it, which is near Jerusalem. And to get to it, no matter what direction you come from, you have to walk through a whole lot of nothing. It's just dead desert all the way. And yet for shepherds, frequently throughout the year they would need to move their flocks around, and they'd have to know where the grass is going to be green and where the water is going to be flowing, and many of them would pass through this oasis of En-Gedi as they were doing that. So for two shepherds, it's a very logical reference. And you can imagine, after miles and miles of walking with your sheep without food or water for you or them through the wilderness, when you come to this beautiful, lush oasis of En-Gedi with flowers and green plants everywhere, your heart would be lifted. And the flowers you saw there would look better than flowers you saw anywhere else, because they were just that exceptional. There'd been so much death and lifelessness surrounding you, and now you're here with this life-giving stuff. And she's saying he is like those flower petals. Like that, just the sense of him and his presence, it is like that pleasant scent that surrounds her and permeates her. This, for whatever reason, this makes me think of back when I was in college years ago, and I had this roommate, and he really loved his Axe body spray. And you know, some people will take the body spray and they'll spritz themselves a little bit. This guy didn't know how to do that. He had a different strategy. He wanted even distribution. So he would stand just at the doorway of our dorm room, and he would take this can and he would light up the sky with it, just swirling all around, making this big cloud of Axe. And then, as if it was a religious experience, he would walk into it like this. And to make matters worse, while I was a pre-med major, grinding my head into a pulp on all of these biology classes and chemistry classes and stuff like this, he skipped all of his classes and went out to the clubs every night and was pretty much just ignoring school. So I'd be trying to go to bed, and I have asthma, and he put this cloud of stinky spray in the air, and I can't, to be honest, I've more than once thought, I should just get my lighter and walk over there and at least maybe then he'd stop. But so this perfume filling the room, it's not stinky like Axe body spray. It's actually a pleasant aroma, she's saying. And being around him has that same sort of intoxicating smell. It's just, wow, I'm near you. I feel so much more relieved to be around you. There's a pleasantness in the air that can't be described. And so again, you get the sense that these guys are starting to like each other. Seems like it, right? Their favor for each other is growing pretty strongly. So let's finish out the passage and read verses 15 through 17. How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves. She. How handsome you are, my beloved. Oh, how charming. And our bed is verdant. He. The beams of our house are cedars. Our rafters are firs. Okay, so these two, we can imagine the scene. They're sitting out here, out where the sheep are grazed and where the afternoon heats. When the afternoon heat comes out in the desert, you don't want to just be sitting out on a sand dune in the middle of it, right? So you go try to find some trees or some foliage to be around. And in effect, they're spelling out what the setting is. Here we've got this green, planty surface that we're sitting with, surrounded with these other shepherds, and we look up and these big cedars that we're taking shelter under, they're almost like a house. It's as if we're building our home together as we have these conversations, we're communicating with each other, and the more they spend this time together, the more in love with each other they're falling. Now, one of these verses was probably confusing in some regards. The first verse there, 15, where he says, you are beautiful, how beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves. This doesn't seem like a predictable pickup line, does it? Guys, you can try this at home with your wives and see how it works. Hey there, dove eyes. Hey, horse face. It's biblical. I'm just saying. So, no, probably not the right way to do it. Okay, so doves in the ancient society had a little bit of a different context than they do in our society today. And that's because doves were part of the sacrificial system. And not just any doves, but the purest white doves that you could find. And we actually see this in the birth account of Jesus himself. His parents are supposed to go to the temple and offer up a lamb to be sacrificed to dedicate their child, but the Levitical law leaves a provision for poor families, and families who are particularly impoverished, rather than buying an expensive lamb, can actually go get a few pure white doves, and they can offer those as a sacrifice instead. And so, for the ancient Israelite reader who's reading through this, when they think of a dove, they're going to be thinking of a pure white animal and one that is a virtuous creature. It's something that's actually used to pay the price for our sins or pay the price for what we owe God. And so a few elements of this that carry over to human eyes. First of all, in effect, he's saying the whites of your eyes are just a radiant white. They're totally pure. They're totally clear. I get lost in them. But also, there is this image of purity being in her eyes as well, like the dove, that you have that sort of purity, you have that sort of virtue. And I think that it's interesting that the Bible says elsewhere that the eyes are the windows of the soul. And most of us have probably seen this in our lives when we've interacted with somebody. Can you guys remember a time where you met somebody, maybe you've only known them for a short time, but you came up, you met him, and you thought, that guy is evil. I don't know what it is, but my skin's crawling, that guy is evil. Just looking in his eyes, you felt like you could tell, right? Most of us have probably experienced that at some point. Or, on the flip side of that, maybe you've come up and met somebody, you've not even had a conversation with them, but you've come up and there's just something about it. You look in their eyes and you say, boy, that lady seems super sweet. That must be one of the nicest ladies I've ever met in my life. It's strange. And so, we can all have these interactions. In effect, he's saying, I looked in your eyes, and not only are they beautiful and pure white, but I see this innocence and this virtue in you, and it's spellbinding. So he sees this element of being with her. Now you can see this relationship has just begun, and it's already starting to crank up quite a bit, isn't it? These two are really developing strong feelings for each other. And we might even describe the phase of the relationship that they're in as infatuation. This may be based a little bit less on the honest time that they've spent knowing each other and more on just the excitement of this early romance and the idea of each other. And that's a common thing to have early on in a relationship. It's important that a relationship eventually move beyond that, though, because those sort of sentiments and feelings can be deceptive. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. One of the things I want to point out to you about this first section, and really where our application today comes from, though, is in the earlier verses where she says that his name is like perfume poured out. She doesn't know him very well yet, but she knows his reputation. She's asked around the community, and this guy has lived in such a way that it seems like anyone she asked, hey, what do you think of that guy? They say, wow, that is a young man of great integrity. That's a good man right there. That's the kind of person that you should pursue after. And there's a real weight to this. And it's interesting to know just how important the character of that person is. And similarly, when she starts talking about her circumstances, and although her complexion isn't the kind that is as idealized in her culture, here she is as somebody who's hardworking and who's virtuous. And she is helping keep her family afloat by going out and doing the work that her brother should be doing. And he must see this and know, this lady's got integrity. This is the kind of person I want. The kind of person I want to be married to. And it really focuses into us the importance in our relationships. And this is for dating relationships, but this is also for friendships, guys. It's equally applicable to that. The importance of actually asking some questions, first of all, about the character of the person that we're interacting with, and second of all, about ourselves in that. It's strange because we can get caught up in these feelings, but one of the most important questions you can ask when you're getting to know somebody new is, what is their integrity like? You know, it's interesting. I talk to young people on a regular basis, and often I'll talk to people and they say, well, I went out on a date with her, but, you know, it just seemed like we didn't have a lot of chemistry. And we have different likes and dislikes. And there's some value in that. I'm not trying to downplay that too much. There's some value in having similar things that you like. But if one of you was really big on football and one of you was real big on golf, is that actually going to tank a marriage? No. No, it's a matter of personal taste. You know, if she's all about Mexican and you're all about Chinese food, we'll be okay. We can survive this. These matters of personal preference are not as big an issue. On the flip side of that, though, if his integrity is broken, and he has a violent temper, and he never keeps his word, and he treats other people like they're totally inconsequential to life itself, should you marry him and try to fix it? No, right? We've seen that, right? It's not smart. Integrity, character, it's key. It's something we actually have to think about. And it's not just, again, for dating relationships, it's for friendships too. Now, don't get me wrong. You can be friends with somebody who has some character issues. And the ideal thing is if you're actually pulling them towards virtue. That's what you should be doing in that relationship. If you're spending a lot of time around with them and you're becoming more and more like them every day in the worst ways possible, that's probably a sign that this isn't the person you should be hanging out with. And if that's happening in a dating relationship, that's certainly a sign that this isn't the person that you should be dating. This is something we've got to think about. So, as you guys look at relationships in your life, I know there's a lot of people who are here who have been married since this book was written 2,000 years ago. Well, not mine, but a lot of you have a lot more experience in this. I get that. But you can still apply this by looking at the friendships in your life, but especially for the teenagers in our room and for the younger unmarried people in our room. This is so key. This is such a big mistake to make. And you can't go into a relationship expecting that you're going to fix that other person's character. God can do that, but you can't predictably expect that you will. And you might be able to find common interests where there aren't any, but you can't just wave a magic wand and make that go away. And so, it's so important in those early phases of friendships or dating relationships that we actually have a discerning eye, that we ask those questions, that we look for the evidence of how that person treats others around them and what their integrity is like. And another element of that, of course, is we can look at ourselves too, right? Andy Stanley, years ago, asked the question to a similar point of, are you the person you're looking for is looking for? Kind of confusing, right? Are you the person in relationships, the kind of good, virtuous person you'd like to be friends with, or you'd like to be in a dating relationship with? Are you the type of person that they'd actually be drawn to? Or are you living life in such a way that they turn around and run the other direction? If the later is the case, then it's probably time to start making some changes in your own life, right? To start making sure that that character does shine through. Because it makes a big impact. If your life is all about you and what you want, whenever you want it, that's not a good thing. That's quite toxic. Other people aren't going to want to be around you as much. And on the other hand, if you're living selflessly, if you're frequently thinking about other people, praying for them, looking for ways that you can bless them and be good to them, that's attractive. Whether it be in a friend or in a spouse. That's really attractive. Similarly, if you have a hot temper and you go off at the smallest of things, none of us really want to deal with that, if we're honest about it, right? And you can address it. You have the choice. Or if you're totally unpredictable in how you're going to handle situations, if you are unpredictable in whether you're going to keep your word when you give it to somebody, all of these different indexes of integrity are good indexes to look at in yourself and really ask the sober question, because you can't fix that other person, but you can sure do some real things to fix you. You can make a decision to do it. And whatever relationship you might be looking for, whether it be friendship or a dating relationship, your character is one of the most key elements to who you are and to how ready you are for that. And that is where I want to challenge all of you today. Be thinking about that. Be asking yourself that question and be willing to make a ruthless assessment. And here's a scary one. You can even ask some people with good character around you where they think you're at, where your shortcomings are, what you can work on. You might learn some stuff you didn't expect. Maybe there's some aspects of yourself you don't see that you could work through. But I want to encourage all you to be prayerful about it this week. It was essential in this relationship. These two people wouldn't have liked each other had it not been for their reputations and their established good character. And we need to work to the same end. We want to have successful relationships in our life the way that God wants us to. All right, with this, I'll call one of our leaders forward to do our communion and offering meditations. As they come forward, I'll ask you to join. I'll ask our deacons to come forward too and ask you to join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, it's really easy to turn a microscope on somebody sitting around us and to not look in a mirror and look at ourselves. And I pray that you'd help us today to deeply see where we're at in our relationship with you and where we're at in terms of living out your truth and the principles you give us to live by. Lord, we want to be people who are appealing to be in friendships with and to be in relationships with, and yet we're not focused on you and not really looking at ourselves soberly and missing. So I pray that you would give us that sobriety, that you give us that clarity of thought to see areas where our character is wanting and to surrender them to you so that you might change our hearts and grow us into the men and women you want us to be. Father, we thank you for the hope we find in you and the power that your love and your spirit gives us to overcome even these broken areas in ourselves. We surrender them to you now. In the name and merit of Jesus Christ. Amen.